Welcome to video 24. This one is dedicated to slicing of lists. So the purpose, guys, is to understand the purpose of slicing and how to use this with lists in Python. As usual, guys, the Python monster resources are there at your disposal. So let's crack on and do some examples of slicing lists in Python. Slicing is the Python name for extracting a subset of items from a larger collection. So this could include creating a substring from a string of characters. It can also mean extracting items from a list to form a sublist. So if you look at the screen, if we wanted to choose the items cheese, Pepsi and pasta to form a smaller and separate list, we would say we have sliced the shopping list to give us a new list comprising those three items. And of course the original list remains the same, it doesn't change. Now a great way to start exploring slicing lists is actually to go back to basics with the Python for loop, specifically with the range syntax in fact. Now you remember the mnemonic, the three S's, start, stop and step. It's also applied to slicing as well, which means we can specify the index where we want to start a sublist from a larger list, the last index for the end of the sublist, and steps is the equivalent to saying, do we want to include all or just some of the items in between the start and the stop position. So in fact the syntax for the range part of a for loop is almost exactly the same as the slice syntax that we would apply to a list. So let's remind ourselves quickly of some of the key characteristics of the range syntax for loops, and then we'll do a comparison with what we can do with slicing. So on the screen you will see a simple for loop which iterates through the entire list and prints all of the string items in the list, and this works because the default values of start is 0 and the default for steps is the all-inclusive iteration of 1. So let's put those back in again to give the full syntax. So that would be 0, len, okay, comma 1. Let's just run that to make sure we get the same thing. And there we go, guys. Okay, so you can see it's an all-inclusive iteration that's looped through the entire list and printed out the entire content. Now likewise I can set a different start value of say 2 and do a partial iteration by virtue of a different start position. So let's do that now. Let's change this to 2. Okay, and let's run. Okay, now you can see that we've got 3 items in the iteration and we've started at Pepsi Max and we've included pasta and mixed salad. So the question is, how do I create a substring of these values and assign them to a new variable? So that's just those 3 values that you see on the screen. So let's put some code in place that does the slicing to copy those 3 values to a new variable. So let me just zoom out a little bit, and what we need to do is we need a new variable, so I will call that sublist, and that becomes, okay, and then we want shopping list, and I'm so confident that the syntax is practically the same. I'm actually going to copy this. Okay, I'm going to paste it on the end and then I'm going to make a few changes. So in order to distinguish between the two concepts, we change the circular brackets to square brackets and we change the comma to a colon. Okay, not sure what happened to the square bracket at the end there, but there you go. And of course let's print this out so you can see what substring actually has been assigned with. So let's do print sublist, sorry. Okay, and let's run that and see what we get with sublist. Okay, so now guys, you can see the iteration gave us a printout of the string items of the list, but what we've got with the slicing is we've actually assigned a child list, if you like, of those 3 values to a completely new and separate list, and you can tell that because of course we have the data structure identification at either end, which of course is the square bracket, which tells us that this is a list data structure. So you may be wondering if the slicing has defaults too, just like we use the 0 and the 1 default values for loop, and in fact it has exactly the same defaults as the for loop, but we do need to be a little bit careful because let me show you what happens if we use those defaults. So if we use the 0 and 1 default, okay, in other words starting at index 0 and in steps of 1, so we know that the for loop would work like this. Okay, so logically we ought to be able to say this when we're slicing. However, can you see a problem potentially with this statement here? How is this going to be evaluated, guys? Okay, is this saying I want a copy of the list as a sublist that includes all of the items, or is it saying something else? Well, in fact, this is the same syntax that we use to specify a unique index value for an item in the list, and this is not going to work for two reasons, and I will show you. In fact, I will prove it to you by running this. Okay, so we will get excuse me, guys. So you can see here, this is the part of the code that relates to the iterations. That's worked fine because that's a fully inclusive iteration by virtue of the default 0 and steps of 1, but it says index out of range. And we've got two problems with this. The first one is that that doesn't actually mean extract a set of values. Okay, and shopping list at position len doesn't exist anyway, because len is the last index plus 1. So we've actually gone over all of the index values available in the list. Okay, so we've gone beyond the last index value. So the logical question then is, how do we use those defaults? And we use the defaults by keeping in the separator character. So what we do, let's just get rid of those boxes, and I'm just going to move this over a little bit, guys. All right, so to make the distinction, we actually leave the colon in for this default value. All right, and that says specifically to Python, we don't want a unique index value for an item in the array. We actually want to do the equivalent of looping through and including all items. So let's run that and see if we get something a little bit more useful. Okay, and indeed we do, guys, because you can see here that we've now got slicing, which has basically included all of the original list. So that's worked fine. So there's a sort of general rule of thumb here, is that when we can't get away with expressing exactly the same syntax that we do in the in-range syntax, then we'll probably need to put in a clarifying colon, just so that Python's aware of what it is that we're trying to do. Okay, let's get rid of those boxes again. Well, of course, guys, we can also change our steps as well. So let's move this over. So I'm going to pop our default values back in just so that we don't confuse issues. So I'm going to put 0 and 1 back in, and I'm going to do likewise with our slicing. So let's put 0 and colon 1 in, and of course we can change iterations. So let's do iteration in steps of 2, and let's put in the same requirements for our sublist. So let's run that and see what we get. So as you can see, as you would imagine, we get exactly the same thing. All right, we get steps of 2. So what is it? Are we using the same language basically to describe what's happening? Well, with iteration, we're basically saying to Python, only include every other iteration. The language that we would use for slicing is basically to say, to work out which items in the list to include in the new substring, basically miss out every other item. Okay, so it's very similar. It's a very similar way of thinking and expressing what's going on here. So a couple more things. As you know, in looping, okay, we can loop in reverse. In other words, we can do a countdown when we are iterating using a for loop. Can we do the same thing with slicing? Can we copy or extract a substring which is in reverse? And the answer is we can, with some quirky differences. So how would we do that, first of all, with a standard for loop? Well, what we would do is let's change this. Because we're counting down, our start value is at the other end of the list. Okay, so we would say len -1, okay, to make sure we're starting within range, and then we would go down to -1, okay, because it's down to but not including. Okay, and our steps is going to be -1 as well. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this out for the moment because I'm just interested in the results that we get for our iteration. Okay, particularly if I can get the bracket in the right place. So what's this saying now? What have I done? Len minus counting range with the colon in the end, of course. So let's run that and see what we get. And we've got mixed salad back to bread, okay, which is good because we started with bread and ended up with mixed salad in the original list. That's worked okay. So what happens if we try and do something similar? Okay, so let's we want to keep that in. no we don't, so let's take that all out. Okay, yeah, so let's pop this back in and see what we get with the slicing equivalent. So then -1, okay, down to -1, okay, in steps of -1. Okay, let's see what we get. And in fact it gives us a null list, in fact an empty list. Now the actual culprit here, and it's a particular aspect of the slicing code that's used, okay, the system code behind the scenes. The actual culprit here is -1, okay, because when we are doing a loop we can actually iterate, okay, beyond the last value. So we can go to -1 even though position -1 doesn't exist in the iteration that we're performing. But when we come to slicing, we can't actually go beyond the last index value. So if I put 0 in there and let's run it, okay, that should work, but you'll find that we're missing one item. So if we look at the excuse me, obviously because we haven't gone down to -1 and 0, okay, we've gone from mixed salad down to cheese instead of mixed salad down to bread. So this syntax doesn't work, and it's one of the few examples of where the syntax isn't quite the same, okay, or we can't exactly generate the same results. So there is a very special syntax that we use to enable us to include the complete list in reverse for slicing. And what we do, guys, is we just get rid of everything apart from 2 colons and -1. Okay, and this is a sort of special, famous or infamous syntax which programmers in Python tend to remember uniquely as the syntax for achieving this result. So let's run that and see if we get what we were hoping to get in the first place. Okay, so indeed, of course, we get the same results with our iteration, but now you can see that this bizarre one-off syntax has worked for us, extracting the entire list but in reverse from mixed salad back to bread. Okay, which is the reverse indeed, guys, of what we had in our original list. So we're almost done, guys, but there's a couple of other little tricks of the trade in addition to the one that you saw just now with the : -1, which I want to show you, and it's with reference to the way in which expressions are used for extracting strings, particularly in other languages, but it also applies to lists as well. So for this part we don't need the loop. I'm going to take the iteration out because this applies exclusively to slicing, okay, or finding subsets of larger collections. So what you will often find is that in other languages the subset that we want, or the smaller collection, is expressed in terms of positions from the left of the collection or positions from the right of the collection. So we might say, for example, find the 2 items from the left, so it's counting from the left of the collection. Okay, and the syntax of other programming languages includes the ability to be able to do this, but we don't have this in Python. But it is reflected in the OCR ERL, and we'll be looking at this in more detail with strings, guys. Okay, so find the 2 items from the left hand side of the collection. So that basically means if we start off on the left hand side of the collection and we count 2, we go from bread to cheese. Okay, so it basically means in this case the items bread and cheese, those are the first 2 items from the left hand side of the collection. Okay, so the way that we find that instantly using Python syntax is we simply put a colon in the middle. If we're dealing with items on the left hand side of the list, we put our number on the right hand side of the colon, okay, and that will be 2. Okay, so we put the number 2 on the right hand side of the colon, and that will bring back bread and cheese. Okay, so let's run that and make sure it does, and there you can see, guys, we get bread and cheese. Okay, now sometimes other languages will express the same type of thing but from the right hand side of the list. So it will say find 3 items, okay, at the right hand end of the list. So if we look at the 3 items at the back end of the list, okay, that would be Pepsi Max, pasta and mixed salad. Okay, so in order to find those 3 items, okay, by virtue of an expression that talks about the right hand side of the list, Okay, what we do is we put the number on the left hand side of the colon, so that's 3, but you need to remember to put minus in. Okay, so you just have to remember these little trick of the trade rules, okay, to express this instantly in Python. So let's run that now and make sure that works. Okay, and you can see, guys, that we do indeed get Pepsi Max, pasta and mixed salad. So this is the Python equivalent of syntax that you find in other languages, which gives you the option. It's a bit like having a right or left function and putting a number in, and other programming languages like VB, for example, do exactly that. And in Python we also have a little excuse me, guys, a little tricky shortcut, which instead of using the left or right to express where we want to get those items from, we just use the position around the colon. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this video. As I said, we will be doing more with string manipulation to look at slicing, and probably some challenges in there as well, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.